Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome John Grisham back to uh, virtual Literati for a conversation about A Time for Mercy, the new novel. So some housekeeping. We're in a webinar today. The chat is closed to you, but you might want to keep the chat window open. I'll be sure to drop a link to purchase a copy of A Time for Mercy from Literati Bookstore. We have signed copies at the store. So if you live in Ann Arbor, Southeast Michigan, there are signed copies available to you to pick up curbside. And you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com, more of John's books as well. Thousands of titles are available for a curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan. And in lieu of a book purchase, we do also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this month or this week's or this year's subscription to our event programming, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where and when in the world you might be joining us from. We'll be putting this on YouTube later. And if you're watching there on YouTube, there are links to purchase books from the store in the description below. And for those of you who are on our webinar, once again, I'll remind you, you can use the webinar's Q&A feature to ask John questions at any time. So feel free to start using that Q&A feature right now if you'd like to, and I'll be looking through your questions and asking a selection of them throughout our conversation. But without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome John Grisham, the author of 35 novels, one work of nonfiction, and a collection of stories, and 7 novels for young readers, whose new novel, Time for Mercy, is the #1 New York Times best-selling book today. Congratulations, John, on that. And it's no surprise to me, but congratulations. And thanks again for joining us on At Home with Literati.
Thanks, John. Happy to be back virtually in Ann Arbor. We were here back in May, I think, with Camino Winds, and had a nice chat, nice visit, a lot of fans, and look forward to this.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you here. And yeah, you're on a new virtual tour. You did a virtual tour for Camino Winds. You're doing a virtual tour for this. You mentioned to me right before we went live that that Zooming has become the word of the day in the household. So I'm just wondering how you're continuing to adjust to what was a busy life pre-pandemic, moving around in support of these books, and how it is fitting in writing time and time to do all the things that you sort of central to your work, in addition to sort of basically looking at your computer screen all day and talking to people.
Well, this is kind of fun because it gets me away from the actual the screen where I write. So I'm looking at a screen far too many hours a day, but this is something real and live, and I'm talking to people, and as I bounce around the country and seeing all these great bookstores and meeting the booksellers, and also taking questions from some very nice people who are buying the book. So this is quite enjoyable. Today's a typical day. This is Thursday, October 22nd. The book came out Tuesday of last week. I got up this morning early and went to my office. We live on a farm about 10 miles south of here, way out in the boondocks, and that's where I live and write. And I come to town in Charlottesville midday. That's where I am now because the internet's better.
Yes.
Than where we live. And so I wrote for 4 hours this morning, which is a typical day, and then hustled in for another Zoom, a noun. It's also a verb.
Right.
So are you Zooming today? I Zoom, adverb, adjective, probably everything else. So it's made me write a lot because I have nothing else to do. I can't go anywhere, can't travel, and so I started Time for Mercy in January because I always start in January. I do a lot of writing January, February, March. Those are good months to write. And then COVID hit in the middle of March.
Right.
Suddenly I couldn't go anywhere. So the book got thicker and thicker and thicker. I think it's the longest book I've written so far. And I wanted to cut some of it, but it was just story got complicated and nobody wanted to cut it. So that affected my writing a little bit. I've been reading a lot. Initially, I was pretty distracted by the pandemic and worried. It was frightened. We all were. And I found it hard to read. I'd never found it hard to write. I could go off into the fictional world each morning and kind of get lost for a few hours, and that was good. Then I started reading more and more, and as we've seen throughout the pandemic, book sales have remained fairly strong in some areas. It's tough on the independent stores, the bookstores, the brick and mortar stores, tons of online traffic, but overall the numbers have not been that disappointing because people are reading and buying books. So that's something good that might come out of this. But yeah, I'm just adjusting like everybody else. I'm exhausted by the campaign. Can't wait for it to be over. We're almost in this perpetual campaign mode in this country. We're always, it's every year another election, and that kind of wears you down. So it'll be nice when that's over, and the commercials are gone and all that kind of stuff. And,
Yes.
so we're fatigued by the virus. The numbers are going up almost everywhere in the country. And a month ago, I didn't know anybody personally who had been infected, and since then we've learned that 3 people that we know pretty well, including one of my nephews, has been infected. They're all doing well. Nobody's real sick, but still, we're hearing more and more stories about it's like it's getting closer and closer, and we get more and more careful. But you don't know. It's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, it's heartening to hear that you can take 4 hours in the morning and still be writing in those. I mean, I just hear a lot from authors. I think we at the store have done. I know I've spoken to over 200 authors since COVID, just doing these virtual events, and the thing you hear so often is, one of the things we'd be asking authors is, what are you reading, or what are you writing, or what are you working on right now? And early on, and especially with the things that were happening in cities with the uprisings in June, was just sort of, like, I can't write. I don't have the bandwidth for it right now. And like, I try to read and I can, get through a couple paragraphs and then I get distracted by something. So but I think it is a push and pull. And there's definitely people who are jumping to books right now. And we see that as well and appreciate it. And I'm wondering too, I mean, you're saying you started A Time for Mercy in January and we're writing it into sort of the quarantine and lockdown of COVID. And it also, it's a book that touches on topical issues and political issues that are certainly were part of the earlier Jake Brigance novels as well. And so I'm curious if the things that sort of happened during I think your books always kind of touch on something that's happening in society. And it must be tough when the news, especially this year, is just accelerating and relentless, that things are coming up that seem to be adjacent to the stuff you're working on. And you maybe are in an editing process where like it's too late to sort of have that stuff color your writing. So I'm wondering how, especially this year and this book, how you are able to navigate writing a book that's really speaking to something that's happening in our moment without feeling the pressure of it constantly needing to be up to date, if that makes sense.
Well, the thing about the story takes place in 1990. The story takes place 5 years after the trial of Carl E. Haley in The Time to Kill. And so Jake, I've gotten quite a bit older, but Jake has not. Jake is only 37.
Right.
We started with the same age when I wrote A Time to Kill. The story is fairly straightforward, and in the first chapter who kills who.
Right.
The suspect, the killer, the kid with the gun, is a 16-year-old boy who pulls the trigger, sadly, and the victim is a 34-year-old boyfriend of the kid's mother, who is abusive and violent, and they live in a terrible situation.
Right.
And after a bad night, one night, the kid felt threatened, very threatened, and he pulled the trigger. You find out pretty soon that the deceased was a deputy sheriff who was highly regarded in Ford County by the Sheriff Ozzie Walls and everybody else. Turns out he had a very dark side, as a lot of people do in that business, and for a bunch of reasons. So I didn't begin the story expecting to comment or confront police issues, as we have seen. Those issues have been around a lot here lately, but since I started writing the book in January, we've had George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and Treona, the girl in Louisville, the three really terrible cases. I was not trying to deal with that issue in this book because the deceased is not accused of
Right.
Police brutality or racial killings or whatever. That may be a future book, but it was not in A Time for Mercy. The biggest legal issue in A Time for Mercy is how do you handle 16-year-old murderers? Back in 1990, it was not unusual, and I'm still practicing law. 1990 was the last year I was a lawyer.
Mm.
Quit after that. But I did a lot of criminal defense work, and back then it was not unusual in your death the active death states, mainly southern states in Texas. It's not unusual to put a teenager on trial for capital murder,
right,
for killing someone with the right circumstances. And the Supreme Court has since said that is wrong and you can't do it, about 10 years ago. And the Supreme Court has also said you cannot sentence a teenager to life without parole, because that is in effect a death sentence. So those are two significant Supreme Court decisions, but they didn't come about until 10 or 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1990, when the story, and that's one reason I put the book in 1990, was to take advantage of that old bad law,
mm-hmm.
and present the question to the reader as the question is presented to the jury. Basically, what do you do with a 16-year-old killer who pulls the trigger and does as much damage as a 40-year-old gunman? Okay, how do you treat kids like that? And I don't answer the question in the book because
right.
I don't know the answer.
Right.
I could never come to grips on what is a fair punishment for these very troubled kids. It's still a question. I may pursue it later.
Pursue it in future novels or
yeah. There's always a future novel.
Right.
I'm always looking for the next issue or subject matter to base a legal thriller on. Not all of them deal with issues. Nowadays, most of them do, because I'm really concerned about criminal justice and
right.
criminal injustice. And the more problems I see, the more I want to write about them and hopefully raise awareness and also tell good stories. There's so many good stories in the criminal justice system because there's such injustice, there's such suffering, there's such waste of life and time and all that. And so I'm always looking for stories set within the criminal justice system. That's what I like to write about.
Well, there's also a deeper layer too. I mean, you mentioned there's this layer of legal precedent or the law in the United States, and then that sort of touches on maybe topical issues of that time, and I think even your works that are set in the past are sort of prescient for issues that we have today. But hearing you talk about the idea of having these works not answer these questions or not resolve them, that's sort of, there's like a deeper philosophical component, right? Which is that for a long time we've used narrative storytelling to explore issues in a way that is sort of non-argumentative and doesn't have to be bounded by sort of like having a sort of like a thesis statement and then your topic paragraphs or whatever. It's more of like a thought experiment of sort of putting this art out into the world and then having it kind of can make us confront these issues in a kind of condensed fashion. So I think that's so maybe something that draws readers to your work continually is facing these issues is with you. And of course you're always a very acute guide, and they're thrilling too. So I don't want to lose that component.
Yeah, they better be thrilling. They better have an element of mystery. This is popular fiction,
right?
And hopefully, I mean, I aspire to write hopefully a high quality of popular fiction. I'm not going to attempt to write serious literary fiction. That's not what I have no interest.
Right.
But the best books I write are the books where I take an issue. In The Guardians, the book last year, the issue was wrongful convictions.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, I wrote a book on for-profit law schools called The Rooster Bar. I've written several books on wrongful convictions, on the death penalty. I wrote a book one time about the futuristic idea of what are we going to do as a nation when we wake up one morning and realize we know by clear DNA proof that we just executed the wrong person.
Yeah.
How are we going to react as a people? I don't know. I've written a book about the pitfalls of electing judges in the appeal. It's a terrible idea. Most states do it, but we need to get the politics out of the judiciary because it really pollutes our versions of what's right and wrong. Anyway, so I will deliberately take an issue like that and weave it through a legal thriller and get the reader hooked because again, this is entertainment, but also entertainment with an edge, and hopefully raise awareness. Not that this is going to make a big impact because I don't take it that serious. I don't think reading nowadays has the impact that movies or even music can have. Anyway, because there aren't many readers in this country. We don't read as much as we used to. So anyway, I don't take it that serious, but I am serious about discussing certain issues that need to be brought forward, and that's why I'm always thinking about the next issue. You mentioned the pandemic. I can't see me writing a novel about the pandemic. However, if you will as we read the newspapers every day, lawsuits are already flying. Several lawsuits against nursing homes for patients who were not properly protected, lawsuits by employees of nursing homes and hospitals who were not properly protected. I have a friend who's a very successful business guy, and he had business interruption insurance. Mm-hmm. It was very expensive. Mm-hmm. And he griped every year when he had to write the big check for the premiums because he would never use it, right? But he's a smart guy. Well, this year when the pandemic hit, he had to close everything. He pulled out the policy. His lawyer contacted the insurance company, and it covers pandemics, plagues and pandemics. That's in the policy. And the insurance company did what it is doing to every other policyholder and denied coverage. And so just flat out denied coverage. So the lawsuits are filed. That litigation will rage for years. So there's going to be a body of law that comes from the pandemic that's maybe irresistible at some point. I can't say I'm not going to write about it because some of these cases are going to be fun to follow.
Well, so you mentioned that A Time for Mercy is dealing with a specific legal issue that was interesting to you, but you brought it to this, very famous character of yours, who in A Time for Kills, based on you and your experiences at that time. How do you, what is the process from? This is in large part the sort of the legal or the sort of jurisprudence I want to discuss, or a compelling case I want to talk about, or a legal or ethical issue that I want to explore in my fiction, to bring it to, one of your most beloved and famous characters, or to a new series, or to a standalone novel?
Well, that's the art of storytelling. That's the challenge of storytelling, is to take an issue that may otherwise not be that compelling and make it fun for the reader. The biggest challenge in A Time for Mercy, as with almost every book set in the courtroom, is getting through the trial without putting the reader to sleep, because most trials are pretty dull, especially civil trials. They're just not, they're moments of drama, but they're not that compelling as a general rule. And A real trial, like you read about in Time for Mercy, would probably last for at least a week, stretch into week two, which is not a long time. Some jurisdictions take forever to pick a jury, one by one. Others get right through it. So, but in the book, I think the trial's over in 3 or 4 days. It's got to be thorough. You got to have witnesses. You got to have the proof, but you cannot have all the back and forth with the lawyers and cross-examination. That goes on forever. And again, it's a challenge to keep the courtroom stuff on a pretty fast pace, or you're gonna put the reader to sleep. And so, but back to Jake. Jake is a very well-known character now. He was first appeared in 1989 in A Time to Kill. I waited 24 years before I brought him back in Sycamore Row in 2013. We were surprised, pleasantly surprised, when Sycamore Row came out to see the reception Jake had. I didn't really appreciate the fact that Jake, through Matthew McConaughey in the movie and through me in the book, is a pretty popular character. And the response to Sycamore Row was impressive. And I said, okay, I'm not going to wait 24 more years back. So I started looking for a story, and it's not always easy to find one that will fit. And I thought about different scenarios, and also Jake's a small town lawyer in Mississippi. He can only have so many huge courtroom cases in a career.
Right.
And that's just not what happens in the daily practice of law in a small town. It's pretty mundane. So I had to wait for the right case to come along, and finally heard about a real case in which a young kid, I think he was 16 or 17, very immature, very traumatized, had a horrible life through no fault of his own, and he pulled the trigger, and killed a guy. And he was so traumatized. His lawyer, who was telling the story, court-appointed lawyer, could not get the kid to talk to him, the lawyer, in his jail cell for the first several times they met. The kid needed help in the biggest sort of way before he faced the murder charges. And so there was a very dramatic story that I overheard sort of, and I don't know how it turned out. I don't know all the details, but I didn't need to know. I had what I needed. And so I took that, as I normally do. I normally steal the idea from somebody else. And I said, this will work for Jake. And that's how Mercy came about.
Well, that's people want to purchase the book from the Literati bookstore. I'm actually going to put a link in the chat right now. We've got signed copies at the store if you live in Ann Arbor and want to come curbside and pick one up. Well, you mentioned Matthew McConaughey, and there's a really wonderful video of him on your YouTube reading a excerpt from the new novel, Time for Mercy. And he mentions at the beginning that before he was able to get the role of Jake, he had to be approved by you. And then he said that you told him that he should really thank your wife, Renee. And I don't, if there's backstory or sort of an inside joke there that is not to be revealed, then I certainly understand. But I saw that video and I was curious about, because another thing I often do hear from authors who are having their films optioned or adapted is that they don't have much say in it anymore, and that they're kind of sort of like put at arm's length from the rest of the process. So I think it's cool and interesting that you were involved in the process of casting. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about it, simply because I have another question about McConaughey as well. Only 2 McConaughey questions, I promise.
Well, the first one is I have always tried to stay away from the movie business. I say that I've been very lucky with Hollywood. I've had 10 books adapted, 1 documentary,
right,
it came out a couple of years ago. It was very well done. A TV movie based on a painted house, right, then 8 feature films, and they've all been fun to watch. So I've been lucky. At the same time, I learned early on, like some great advice from Stephen King, was to stay away from the movies. I don't know how to make movies. I don't know where to start. I wouldn't know where to start. Don't want to learn. I'm too books. Not what I do. And I think a lot of writers sell the film rights, and we all want to sell the film rights because the money's good. And also we want a good film made because we all enjoy a good movie. That's just, that's human nature. And so I would love for all my books to be adapted into really good movies. With The Time to Kill, though, I delayed selling it for a long time, even after the first wave of Firm, The Pelican Brief, The Client, The Rainmaker, Runaway Jury, The Chamber. Those movies all came out, mid '90s, and I didn't want to sell Time to Kill. I just didn't. I don't know. I was too protective. Finally, I did, and the only thing I got out of the deal, besides the upfront money, which back then was substantial, unlike now, I wanted to have some input into who would play Jake. What I did not want to have was an actor trying to fake a Southern accent. It's very difficult to do. It may not bother you because you live in Michigan, but we're here in the South, when we hear an actor with a really bad fake Southern accent, it just ruins the whole movie. Okay? And so they suggested a couple of actors to me, and I could not see these guys in coats and ties in a Southern courtroom trying to fake the accent. And I said, no, I'm using my right to challenge this and that. And then Matthew came along, and when we saw the screen test of the tape of Matthew in his office smoking a cigar, and then later giving the closing argument, when Renee my wife saw Matthew, she said, "I like that guy." She said, "Yeah, most women do." And, but we met him, and he was such a great guy from Texas, so he's got the accent. Right. And so it turned into a wonderful experience for us, and he did a really great job with the movie, and made the movie famous, and made it launched his career, and we were thrilled with his success, and always have been.
Well, I will say, as a Michigander, people do try to do. There is a Michigan accent, strange as it may sound, and I moved to Iowa when I was a young boy from Michigan, and I had no idea I had an accent until I went there, and people said, "Why do you say apple?" So I think I sometimes hear people try to imitate the Michigan accent, and it is I understand it. It is grating to hear that.
I love accents. I love to hear somebody on the television, and it's a game my wife and I play. I mean, right off the bat, we're going to say, okay, Upper Midwest, probably Cleveland, or so, just like that, or definitely the Bronx or New Jersey. I mean, it's just there's so many different accents, and you have the standard American accent, which is no accent,
which is Iowa too. That was
Iowa, Kansas, into there, and California. California, there's not much of an accent up there, but I love the regional. My wife's from North Carolina, and very Southern. Family's very Southern. But some of the words they pronounce and some of the things they say are still fascinating. And it's a lot of humor in our family, because my kinfolks are from Arkansas, different accent over there, and so we're always kind of poking fun at each other's kinfolks, which can get you in trouble.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that you watch these movies, and Matthew McConaughey's performance resonates and is powerful, and was a landmark for his career, etc. So I'm just curious, like when you wrote Sycamore Row, and when you wrote the latest, A Time for Mercy, does Jake change in your head? I mean, in A Time for Kill, you're basing it on your own experiences as a trial lawyer, and is it hard to not sort of have that and that performance inflect, how you write? I know you mentioned recently too that you'd love to see Matt reprise his role for an adaptation of A Time for Mercy as well, but
I don't recall thinking about Matthew when I wrote A Time for Mercy. Keep in mind that movie is now 24 years old, and he and I have both grown up. He's aging better than I am. But the thing about writing a character, the only time in my career where I have thought about individual actors was 25 years ago, because the movies were coming out so fast, and those the first wave of big movies I just mentioned a while ago, and we had the big cast, we had all the big stars in those big movies, and I caught myself a couple times writing the current legal thriller, thinking, boy, this would be a great role for that person or that whatever, but that kind of went away. The truth is, I have not had a feature film made in 15 years, because Hollywood makes so few
Right.
smart adult dramas. It's all about making the next cartoon, the next Spider-Man 10. That's where Hollywood is, and putting together funding for one of my legal thrillers is extremely difficult. Nobody wants to do it. No, the studios do not want to make 50 million or 100 million bucks profit on a movie. They want to make $1 billion.
Yep.
And they can do that with a cartoon they can show in China, with a vast market, and it'll gross $2 billion around the world. That's good math if you can do it. And so it really squeezes out a lot of good stuff. And now everybody's going to television, which is good because there's a lot of great television.
Yeah.
But the talent's there, the money's there, the actors are there, and so we've sold several books to television and trying to get them developed. I'm not. The producers are trying to get them developed, but we'll see. But it's just I'm so out of the movie business these days. I just I don't think about movies when I write.
Well, that's good. I mean, I imagine it's probably not helpful to think about adaptation while trying to just get the nuts and bolts of the story out. But I know that Calico Joe is just optioned by Bob Dylan and George Clooney. Is that are they looking into a movie for that, or?
Talk about a strange phone call. This happened it was back in the summertime. It was a hot Saturday afternoon in July, and my agent called from New York. David Gernert is my agent. David bought the firm as an editor at Doubleday in January of 1990. So he and I had been together for over 30 years. He bought and published my first 4 or 5 books. Then he became my agent, and so we talk almost every day. But he rarely calls on Saturday afternoon. But COVID's got us all. COVID is just 7 days a week, and there's no weekend anymore. Every day's the same.
Right.
And David said, I think we're going to sell the film rights to Calico Joe. I said, great. We already sold them twice. We already had 2 option deals that expired. No movie. I said, fine. Let's get the movie made. He said, you're never going to guess who wants to produce and make and buy a Calico Joe. I said, surprise me. He said, Bob Dylan. And I said, I thought he was a singer, not a movie producer. Turns out he likes to dabble in film. And he read Calico Joe when it came out 10 years ago, and really liked it. He had actually called back then, I didn't know it, to inquire to see if the rights were available, and the rights were not available. Somebody else had them tied up in an option. And David said, sure, the rights are available now. So we cut a deal real quick. And he does not mess around. He went and hired George Clooney, I think, to write it, direct it, and produce it, and what else? So that news was released last week. The story was about Bob Dylan, George Clooney, and me doing the Calico Joe, and I thought that's a pretty good lineup.
That's a press junket I'd like to see.
Company, I'll tell you.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with that. Yeah, I mean, it is true that you've had so many successful movies made of your work, but there is this shift now in media that I've been noticing as well, that movies have shifted towards these, right, you need to make $1 billion, so you need to have 15 superheroes in it, right. And then a lot of narrative or adaptation work is going into streaming series. I think James McBride's The Good Lord Bird is an example of that as well, where that's a novel. It's not a huge novel that's being drawn out into a longer series. But you've also had projects like the Innocent Man be adapted into docuseries as well. So I'm curious to see what happens. I know you stay away from it smartly, but It seems that a lot of your work, you've had also network TV adaptations as well, but it seems like there is this new niche in narrative story, visual storytelling with these streaming series and things being more adapted for television that I think lends itself to some of your work. But certainly excited to see a movie, a baseball movie, story by John Grisham,
We'll see.
produced by
I've
Bob Dylan.
learned do not believe it until it's filming, because at that point the money has been spent and or being spent and committed, and once they start filming, there's a good chance it's going to be a movie. The truth is, John, I can't. There's A Time to Mercy was published. A Time for Mercy was published last week. There's not a thing I can do,
right,
as the author, to push that movie into being made. Even if I were to say, I'll give you the film rights for free, then take something on the back end and hope it works. I'll write the screenplay for free. I'll give that to you. Okay, here it is. Take it. That wouldn't work. I mean, I've sort of been down that road, and I just don't get involved in the process because I don't understand the process. I don't know anybody who does, and so I've learned the hard way. Stay away. Do what I do best. Go write another book.
Well, you do such a great job in these books of, we talked about it a bit about they're compelling, they're thrilling, but they're also direct. They're a bit open-ended. They're not super black and white. In her review in the New York Times for A Time for Mercy, Sarah Lyle writes, at a time when our opinions are terrifyingly polarized, Grisham reminds us that people aren't one thing or another, but composed instead in shades of gray. And we talked about this too a bit. You're talking about campaigning, and especially right now, there's pretty fractured and pitched and kind of acrimonious civil discourse. And I think it can sometimes, we can kind of get lost in it and frame our experience of other people, especially in like election years, in this very two-sided way. And so I'm wondering how, you watch the world change with the rest of us, but you're able to write these books about characters who aren't one-sided, and also legal cases usually have one outcome. It's either the outcome one side wants or the outcome the other side wants, but the actualities of the reality behind the case are a bit more complicated. So I'm just wondering, what you bring to characterization, or how you write characters that has this effect of, even in a book you wrote just this year, that you get this really positive response about how not didactic the characters are.
Well, one of the most interesting parts and challenging parts of creating a character is you ask yourself, okay, I've got the general idea in mind. Is this person going to be good or bad? Overall? And if he or she is going to be good, what are the flaws going to be? Because nobody's perfect. If he or she is going to be bad, what are some of the assets? Because very few people are completely bad.
Yes.
And so in good fiction, good popular fiction, oftentimes it's the creation of the bad guys who really carry the story. We don't want to read about, most lawyers are honest, hardworking people who don't make a lot of money. Okay. Nobody wants to read about those people. You want to read about the lawyer who cracks up and blows up his law firm and steals the money and fakes his death and runs away and with his secretary. You want to read the good stuff, the fun stuff. So you got to have people who are very flawed. In this case, Jake has some flaws. I mean, not many. He's a pretty good guy, but he gets caught in the story cheating in a big way in another case, and it just really floors him. It floors the judge. It floors the people who know him. They're totally surprised that Jake would cheat, and he pays a price for it. So yeah, you got to have your characters has got to be, your good guys got to be basically good, but there's got to be some warts on him somewhere. Again, nobody wants to read about. No such thing as a perfect character. So that's always a challenge, and I do it. And you mentioned the courtroom stuff. We will not divulge the verdict because that would kill the surprise for the reader. But throughout the whole book, I kept asking myself, what's the jury going to do? Because the question is so split. The answer is so divided. We don't know what a jury would do with this set of facts. And so once it's presented to the jury, we see them struggle with it. And that's all I can say about the jury deliberations.
No spoilers. Yeah.
I don't want to kill the story.
Well, thank you again for being here. And I just want to remind folks that if they have questions for you, they can ask them to me in the Q&A. People are already starting to do that, and I appreciate it. And of course, I've dropped the link in the chat where you can purchase signed copies of the book from Literati Bookstore. Those are available for curbside pickup if you live in the Southeast Michigan or Ann Arbor area. John, when you're writing these, I know there's our legal cases or precedents that you're looking at, but especially when you get to and again, I'm not going to ask you to spoil anything, but when you get to the deliberation parts and you mentioned trying to like cut through the trim some of the fat of how sort of boring a long weeks long trial can be. Right. But I'm wondering if there is, and also just maybe to get ideas is how in touch do you stay with the legal world? I know you have the Innocence Project and other things that you work on as well, but what does that research look like? Is it just news, or is there a lot of, kind of the same work that someone who might still be in a firm is going through to kind of collect ideas, or to get a sense of, shifting sands in trial cases, et cetera?
It's mainly news. It's primarily what we all see, the headlines. What are the raging issues of the day? What are the fascinating cases? What's going up to the Supreme Court? What's happening? The research is not in depth until I have an issue I want to write about.
Yeah.
And then I'll do some research into that issue,
okay.
Whether it's mass incarceration or things like sentencing disparities or a lot of racial injustice in the system. There are a lot of great books on all these issues. Not
right.
necessarily books you want to read, because it can be some pretty dull.
Yeah.
No. But, once I get the issue in mind, I dig down pretty deep. I don't like to do legal research. For example, I don't want to go find out what the law is in Alabama on habeas corpus. I'm just not I'm not cut out for that. I didn't like research when I was a law student, and I couldn't stand it when I was a lawyer. I tried to but I'll hire a research assistant. We live here in Charlottesville. UVA's here, great law school, top 10 law school, and they have these really bright kids who come in here. I'll hire one of them to do my research for me because I'm just too lazy. And plus, they'll get it right. I'll get it wrong. And I've used several research assistants over the years from the UVA Law School, and great success.
So you have one nonfiction book, The Innocent Man. So I'm wondering if you might have answered my question and sort of a disdain for the getting into the granular of research, but are there any times when you are doing some of this research for a topical case or something you might want to write about in fiction, and something kind of pushes you towards maybe doing something more nonfiction-y? There's been this true crime explosion in the narrative nonfiction in the past couple of decades or so as well.
I'm tempted all the time. My one nonfiction book is called The Innocent Man. It's about a wrongful conviction in Oklahoma where a guy was almost executed for a crime he had nothing to do with. And it was a great story. I just tried to tell it. It was already there.
Yeah.
But I read a lot of wrongful convictions cases because that's where I work on there with the Innocence Project. That has a real interest for me, and every wrongful conviction case deserves a book of its own. They're incredibly compelling stories from a storytelling point of view, because there's a lot of suffering and injustice and misery and waste of time, waste of life, 20 or 30 years in prison for somebody else's crime,
Yeah.
death row for you completely innocent. Those are fabulous stories
Yeah.
for a writer to get a hold of. The problem is, I can't write any more of those because they take up 2 years of worth of research.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's already been done. It's already been done. We've had so many high-profile DNA exonerations in the past 25 years that there are a lot of books written by a lot of people who were wrongfully convicted, and they're all great books. They're all fun to read. But that market's been kind of, I think, kind of maxed out.
I see.
Sadly, we had so many exonerations, and we have so many more innocent people in prison who need to get out. But
Yeah.
I worry that the books have already been written.
I'm gonna shift over here soon to some questions from the audience, but before I do,
I got to scoot. I got to zoom at one. I mean,
if you do it one, okay, then I'll just
wind up in just a minute.
I'll ask a few of these. We'll take up maybe 7 more minutes and wrap up about 55, so you can get on that Zoom. So the first question is, what is one of the favorite characters an audience member asks that you have written about, and why?
Well, when you write a novel, you've got to be in love with your lead character to get to the story. Jake is the only person I've used 3 times now, other than my kids series. I liked Cullen Post in The Guardians, a former lawyer, former minister who now does nothing but innocence work. I like Lacey Stoltz, who in The Whistler, whose job is to investigate corrupt judges in Florida. She may be back one day. So yeah, there's a lot of them.
Someone writes, if you have any particular places or offices that have actually been as you've seen as models for places you put in his novels. For example, Jake Bergance's office in Oxford and Bruce Cable's bookstore on Camino Island.
Good question. Yeah, I've seen a couple of bookstores I can think of where the owners had a really fancy wood-paneled first edition room, like on the first floor, where he kind of keeps his office, but the walls are lined with really expensive books, and that's an impressive thing to see. Jake's office, had a lawyer buddy years ago who had an old office on Main Street, and it had been passed down from his father, and so it was had a lot of character to it, with a huge oak desk and old portraits on the wall and the ceiling fans, and I remember thinking that's a pretty cool place to work.
I'm quite jealous. Another viewer asks, when you started writing A Time to Kill, what were you doing as a lawyer? I know some people might know that you were a lawyer at the time you were writing,
right.
And in Mississippi, correct?
Yes, small town in my hometown in Mississippi. I was one of those small town struggling lawyers trying to make a buck, and there's a lot of competition. There was at least 40 years ago. Too many lawyers, not enough clients, and that's what I was doing. I wanted to be a big courtroom style lawyer, big trial lawyer. So I spent a lot of time in court, in front of juries, with court appointed criminal cases. I would volunteer for them. And that's how I kind of cut my teeth in the profession. That's what I was doing when I started writing Time to Kill.
Someone writes that they want to know if you have any more books coming out in the Camino Winds series.
Thank you for the question. When I finished Camino Island 3 years ago, I really, really liked the locale, the fictional town, the fictional bookstore, and the characters. And I said to myself, I'm going to go back there. And I told Doubleday that, and we cut a 2-book deal.
Great.
Then Camino Winds is the first of those 2. So there's one more coming, probably 2 or 3 years down the road. And I think I have a story. So there's going to be at least 3 because it's under contract. But if there are 4 or 5, that'd be great too. If I can, again, I got to have the story.
And then we haven't mentioned this, but you, other than the beginning, when I've listed off your credits, that you write books for young adults, and someone wants to know if you're going to had plans for more young adult books like Theodore Boone.
Yeah, I've written 7 in the past 10 years, and I would like to write. I'd like to write them for the rest of my career. I'm beginning to worry about being able to sustain a series with a lot of good stories. Um, there will be more, probably within the next couple of years. I don't want to wait too long because Theo has a pretty good following, and I want to keep the series fresh and keep it moving.
Great. Thank you. Well, I want to let you get to your next Zoom. I know you're Zooming all day. But before I let you go, I'm just curious if you're watching the World Series. The Rays and the Dodgers are tied. I know it's the least watched World Series maybe in televised history from what I hear. It's understandable, but just curious about your thoughts. If you're
Well, I'm always a National League guy. Never much of a Dodgers fan, but
there's same snake bit too.
Clayton Kershaw is a special kid to watch.
Yeah.
And enjoyed him night before last. Yeah, I'm keeping up with it, but it's just so weird. Late season, no fans. Although in Texas the other night, they made the stadium look pretty good. There were some people there. Not sure that's a good idea, but there were some folks there making noise, so it sort of resembled a crowd. But it's baseball, and that's all you got. That's all you got.
Yeah, well, Michigan football kicks off this weekend for the
About
first game of
time.
the season.
About time. Welcome to the NCAA. You guys are behind us.
Feels very weird. We'll see if we can fit all those 8 games into 8 weeks. I kind of doubt it, but we'll find out. Well, John, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. We appreciate it so much that you're able to zoom in with us here in our virtual bookstore. And congratulations on all the success of A Time for Mercy. It's New York Times #1 bestseller, and folks can buy signed copies from Literati Bookstore at the link in the chat. And hope to have you maybe in the store someday, but maybe back on Zoom if we're still doing this in a few months for the next one, John. So take care.
Thanks, Sean. See you later. Take care. My pleasure.